They called it salvation. But the screams never stopped. And the ground kept swallowing bodies. There are stories buried so deep in American soil, not even the worms dare speak of them. And yet, the truth finds a way to bleed through. This is one of those stories, not about religion, not about justice, but about control. About what happens when desperate men surrender their will to something darker than sin itself and call it holy. East Texas, 1845, a wild, lawless territory where guilt and redemption often shared the same bed. Into this chaos stepped three brothers, Malachi, Cornelius, and Jebediah Damnation, each cloaked in scripture, each promising purification for the broken. What they built wasn't a ministry. It wasn't even a cult. It was something far older and far more dangerous. A ritual machine that fed on guilt, pain, and flesh. They called their sites redemption camps. But what unfolded inside those canvas walls was not salvation. It was consumption. Hundreds entered. Most were never seen again. Those who emerged were not the same. Their eyes hollow, their speech fractured, as if a part of them had been stripped out and buried in that East Texas mud. You won't find this in your history books. The ledgers were burned, the witnesses silenced, and well, the ground was turned over, repurposed, made clean again. That's how they work. Those who pull the strings behind faith, law, and nationhood, they don't just erase people. They erase memory. But not all of it. A few fragments survive, in old court documents sealed under state privilege, in letters recovered from crumbling basements, in testimonies whispered by descendants who were told never to speak the family name. They call them the damnation bloodline, not just because of what they did, but because of what they were protecting. This video is not just about a forgotten atrocity. It's about a system, one still alive in different forms today. A system that punishes the broken, rewards the cruel, and baptizes control in the language of God. You ready to go deeper? Because once you hear what I'm about to tell you, there's no going back. You were never meant to hear this part. After the Civil War, when the South lay smoldering and broken, the redemption camps didn't vanish. They multiplied. The devastation of war provided them cover. Orphan boys, widowed mothers, deserters, addicts, all easy prey. The Damnation brothers had mastered the art of finding the wounded and turning pain into obedience. But here's what most don't understand. This wasn't just brutality for brutality's sake. It was engineered suffering, ritualized, structured, designed to do something deeper than just torture the flesh. They were crafting obedient vessels, men and women stripped of ego, identity, even memory, and rebuilt in the image of something other. They called it ascension. To outsiders, it looked like fanatic revivalism, fire, brimstone, blood, and Bible. But behind the sermons were carefully orchestrated protocols, trauma cycles, isolation, sensory deprivation, and forced confession, techniques that wouldn't appear again publicly until 100 years later, when intelligence agencies began experimenting with similar methods under different names, MKUltra, Project Artichoke, Bluebird. But the Damnation brothers were doing it in 1850. And they were good at it because they had help. Hidden in the journals of Cornelius' damnation, which survived only because they were misfiled in a small-town courthouse in Nacogdoches, is a single phrase that repeats again and again. The ones who whisper. No names, no faces, only instructions. Cornelius records visions, commands, methods delivered in dreams, in tongues, in what he calls the unvoice. Some scholars have dismissed this as madness. But others, the kind who don't speak openly, suggest something else, that the Damnation brothers weren't just sadists playing preacher. They were conduits, and what flowed through them wasn't divine. Think about it. How did three rural brothers in the 1840s create a system so sophisticated that it mirrors modern psychological warfare? How did they move across states, manipulate newspapers, silence investigations, and vanish the bodies of over 300 souls? Without institutional protection, unless they were the institution, or worse, unless they were feeding it. Tonight, we're not just uncovering a forgotten family. We're unmasking a blueprint, one used again and again by regimes, churches, cults, and corporations. Control the body, break the will, rebuild the mind, then erase the past. You've taken the first real step into darkness. Now we follow the bloodline. Malachi and his brothers believe their ascension rituals cleanse sinners. But beneath that veneer, they were birthing something far more insidious, a legacy. Because the camps didn't end with their deaths, they transformed. The brothers had no children, but they recruited disciples. Broken survivors were remade into teachers, midwives, even preachers who carried a methodology outward like a virus. And every disciple carried the lessons deep into new communities, spreading hidden doctrines cloaked in salvation. One such disciple was a man known only as Elias. Today, nearly untraceable, Elias wrote in his private journal, "He gave me power through brokenness." That sentence alone reveals the true architecture of this scheme. Not just salvation through suffering, but power over suffering. Elias wasn't simply a follower. He became a node in a network, translating the brutal purification into a tool of manipulation. Social, political, psychological. Survivors believe these ghost doctrines seeped into institutions from workhouses to reform schools to early prisons. More than folklore, they became organizational doctrine, weaponizing trauma to enforce obedience, silence, conformity. Think about that. The psychological frameworks used to break a man in an East Texas camp were repurposed by faceless bureaucracies, bankrolled by elites who demanded discipline, loyalty, unquestioning execution. For a few broken men, these methods became a pathway to power, and they use them again and again and again. But here's where it gets more disturbing. Elias claimed contact with the ones who whispered too, surviving recollections of secret meetings in candlelit rooms where nameless benefactors observed and instructed. These sessions weren't about salvation. They were strategic. And the insight they sought wasn't spiritual. It was behavioral. They measured terror's effect on memory. They cataloged confessions. They designed ceremonies to fracture faith so utterly that the fractured psyche became malleable. Hundreds of miles from the camps, new structures followed. Isolation wings in prisons, enforcement of shame rituals in reformatory schools, psychiatric experiments disguised as therapy, and even corporate training sessions using breakdown rebuild exercises. Initiates whispered of redemption by rupture, the principle that only the controlled tearing of one's soul could birth a new obedient shell. Could this be coincidence? Or is this the hidden hand behind modern systems of control? I won't lie, theories this radical unsettle most. But only because they threaten the comfortable narratives we're taught, that time moves forward, that institutions evolve morally. But what if certain institutions are built on the bones of these early camps? What if they still owe their structure to ritualized trauma? If you feel the darkness pressing in, that's not paranoia. That's awakening. Because knowing this means seeing control networks you never knew existed. And that's the first step to dismantling them. You felt the echo of their methods. Now it's time to meet the ones who paid for the blood. No ritual survives without resources. No doctrine spreads without protection. And the damnation camps, while appearing as frontier ministries, were funded, federal guarded, because someone needed them to exist. Someone who understood that power isn't taken by force, it's cultivated through submission. Private ledgers recovered in 1881 from a hidden compartment beneath the damnation family's central chapel in Caddo Parish named 3 benefactors. Not preachers, not saints, bankers, landowners, judges, men with respectable reputations and filthy secrets. They referred to themselves only by aliases, the owl, the harrower, and the third mouth. The records show transfers of livestock, gold coin, and, in some cases, indentured servants. Payment rendered in exchange for a refined process of moral reconstitution. Moral reconstitution. That's how they described the torture of human beings. But what they were after was far more than purity or faith. They were testing human limits, psychological thresholds, obedience under duress. They weren't interested in saving souls. They were building models, refining tools, preparing techniques that could be franchised, institutionalized, and normalized over generations. These financiers didn't vanish with the brothers. Their descendants appear quietly in later institutions, on boards of early penitentiaries, in governing bodies of 20th century orphanages, on the early funding rosters of intelligence programs no one ever authorized. One name appears repeatedly, the Caro Society, a private fraternal order founded in 1889 with a mission to illuminate the path of human will through discipline and purification. Guess where they acquired their foundational texts? Copies of Malachi's sermons, Cornelius' extraction records, and Jebediah's purification metrics, all meticulously cataloged under the euphemism, the doctrine of compliance. Still think this was just a rogue cult? Still think this is history? These techniques didn't die. They evolved into re-education camps, into interrogation programs, into behavioral correction facilities for children labeled troubled or defiant. The language became cleaner, the rituals more sterile, but the intent remained the same: break the will, shape the mind, extract obedience. Every time you see a child punished for questioning authority, every time a whistleblower disappears under psychological evaluation, every time a man is told his suffering is proof of moral failure, not a result of systemic design, you're seeing the fingerprints of the same philosophy. And still, most people refuse to look. But you're not most people. There was a place they never wrote about. Not in the sermons. Not in the ledgers. Not even in the whispered testimony of the few who made it out. They called it simply the pit, buried deep in the pine forest near Caddo Lake. The pit wasn't part of the redemption camp shown to outsiders. It wasn't where the sermons were held, or the public rituals performed. This was something else, off limits to newcomers, sealed by silence, and protected by the most loyal of the damnation converts. A hidden facility, a black site before the term even existed. Survivors never described it fully. Most would only whisper fragments. No light, the watchers, the ladder that didn't reach back up. The pit wasn't about confession. It was about conversion. Total identity erasure. A psychological abyss where the human soul was dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but the raw material of obedience. A handful of recovered documents describe the criteria for being sent there: defiance, spiritual resistance, refusal to confess. But others were chosen for more mysterious reasons: the gifted, as one ledger calls them, people who claim to hear voices, see visions, or resist pain longer than average. In modern terms, targets for experimentation. One journal fragment, written by an unknown insider, describes a descent. They take you at night. No voice, no warning. The sack over the head, the march, the blind fall down stone. You land in blackness, but something's already there, watching, breathing with you. You scream, but the echoes sound like they're coming from inside your own head. There were no clocks, no sun. Time became meaningless. Penitents were stripped not just of food or comfort, but of identity. Names were erased, replaced with numbers. Dreams were invaded. Repeated phrases were drilled in. Pain is cleansing. Obedience is freedom. Identity is illusion. Sound familiar? These are not ancient horrors. They are blueprints for control that would resurface in military black sites, trauma-based conditioning programs, and covert psychological operations. The pit was a prototype, and those who survived it, if you can call it that, they emerged utterly changed. Not free, not redeemed, but willing, no longer resisting, no longer questioning, like hollowed men walking upright in the world, but spiritually dead, because the pit didn't just kill the soul, it rewrote it. His name was Ezekiel Banner, a deserter from the Mexican-American War, a man with blood on his hands and a 1,000-yard stare long before he ever reached the redemption camps. But what makes Ezekiel different isn't the sins he carried. It's that he walked into the pit and somehow walked back out. In 1871, long after the Damnation Brothers had gone underground, Banner reappeared in Galveston, Texas, thin, disfigured, speaking in riddles. He was found wandering the shoreline barefoot, repeating a phrase that made no sense to those around him. I saw the spine of the world break, and they called it love. Local lawmen assumed he was just another vagrant war veteran cracked by trauma. But Dr. Myron Graves, a Civil War surgeon and early investigator of battlefield hysteria, took a special interest in him. Graves had heard whispers of the Damnation family. His own cousin had vanished after seeking purification near the Louisiana border. What Banner revealed under hypnosis shook Graves so deeply he never published the transcripts. But fragments survived, scrawled into the margins of his personal notebook. They strip you down, not just your body but your memory. They inject words into your dreams. They rewrite what you believe is true. And when you resist, they don't punish you. They make you think it was your idea to obey. This isn't frontier superstition. It's programming. Banner claimed the pit was more than a physical place. It was a method, a crucible in which every human anchor, name, memory, morality, was slowly dissolved, until the person left was no longer a sinner seeking salvation, but a reconstructed vessel, ready to serve without question. Graves' records point to a particular ritual called the mirror baptism. According to Banner's broken testimony, the ritual involved long periods of sleep deprivation, followed by disorienting light and sound bombardment and exposure to your own reflection until your identity shattered. It was, in his words, like watching yourself die 1,000 times without leaving the body. Now ask yourself, does this sound like 1800 superstition? Or a precursor to what black budget programs would later perfect? Psychological dismantling followed by identity imprinting? Ezekiel Banner didn't escape the pit with salvation. He escaped with awareness. But no one listened. He was locked away in an asylum 6 months later, labeled insane. Before they silenced him, he left behind one final warning, scrawled into the wall of his cell. They are still among us, wearing collars, wearing uniforms, preaching freedom, practicing bondage. Let's be clear, the damnation family didn't vanish. They embedded. By the late 1800s, what began as isolated camps had become blueprints for institutional systems. And the most disturbing part? They didn't have to force their way in. America, young, chaotic, traumatized by war, invited them. In 1879, 2 years after Ezekiel Banner vanished into the asylum system, a peculiar new proposal was circulated through Louisiana state legislature. It advocated for creation of disciplinary academies for orphaned and behaviorally unfit children. The language was sterile, bureaucratic, but the doctrine underneath? Word for word lifted from Malachi Damnation's Redemption Catechism. And who sponsored this? A man named Reverend Alton Greaves, a former spiritual advisor to the Damnation family, now dressed in civic respectability, backed by donors with ties to railroad tycoons, prison boards, and the Carroll Society. He never used the term pit, but he built one metaphorically. His institution stripped children of names, assigned numbers, and used isolation, shock rituals, and shame fasting to produce compliance. By 1886, 3 of these schools operated in Louisiana, Texas, and Georgia. Their reports praised the transformation of wayward youth into obedient, structured, productive citizens. Behind the scenes, dozens of suicides, hundreds of unmarked graves, and reappearance a chilling term in internal memos: redemption through rupture. Let me make this plain. What happened in those woods wasn't destroyed. It was franchised, psychological operations, faith-based punishment rituals, re-education camps hidden as reform schools. And from there, the methods evolved again. By the early 20th century, the damnation doctrine found its way into early military hazing protocols, insane asylum treatment procedures, penitentiary isolation experiments, and covert training camps for domestic intelligence operatives. The same tactics, identity stripping, trauma repetition, dream disorientation, kept surfacing under different names: moral realignment, character correction, enhanced instruction. The language changed. The core never did. One former school official from the Greaves Academy later confessed under pressure: "We weren't teaching children. We were breaking wild horses and building them back into guards." So ask yourself, if the damnation doctrine lives on in schools, prisons, churches, and even leadership academies, who really controls the systems shaping society? Who taught your teachers? Who trained your preachers? What blueprint did they use? And how many of them traced their knowledge back to a family buried under pine roots and soaked in blood? They thought it was just another collapsed church, overgrown, rotting, swallowed by pine and moss in a forgotten corner of Caddo Parish. Locals called it the Ash Temple, though no one remembered why. A place children dared each other enter, and none stayed long inside, not because of ghosts, but because of what they heard beneath the floorboards. In 1902, a private team of surveyors, hired by the newly chartered Carroll Agricultural Initiative, was sent to evaluate the land for development. What they found wasn't a chapel. It was a cover. The floorboards collapsed beneath one of them. What lay underneath wasn't earth. It was stone, carved slabs, inverted crosses, a ring of rusted restraints bolted into the limestone floor, and in the center, a stone well with no water, just darkness, and a sealed box wrapped in blackened chains. They broke it open. Inside were manuscripts, old, brittle, some in English, others in a language no one could immediately identify. But they bore the seal of Jebediah Damnation, his personal crest, carved into human bone and pressed into wax. One document was titled, "The Four Forms of Compliance, a Blueprint for Absolute Subjugation." It was not spiritual guidance. It was a manual for psychological warfare. The text outlined a four-stage process: disorientation through isolation, rupture of self-image, insertion of external authority, reconstruction through reward and threat. But it wasn't theoretical. Each stage included step-by-step procedures, environmental variables, dietary controls, chemical additives, and sensory manipulation techniques. Remember, we're talking 1800s. And yet these rituals eerily mirror techniques that wouldn't appear publicly until the 1950s and 60s, under names like MKUltra, Project Artichoke, and early counterinsurgency training. How did a secluded cult in the Pine Woods prefigure the exact same methods by nearly a century? Because the Damnation family wasn't inventing madness. They were preserving something older. At the bottom of the well, the surveyors found a metal ring drilled into the stone, attached to a sealed trapdoor. Only one dared open it. What he saw below was never formally recorded. But the next morning, he was found dead. No wounds, just a look of absolute terror, frozen on his face. The remaining team abandoned the site. The Carroll Initiative quietly pulled out of Caddo Parish. The trapdoor remains unopened, but the texts, they were not destroyed. They were handed off to a private collector with ties to the early CIA. They say history is written by the victors. But sometimes, the darkest parts are ghost-written, by the forgotten, the hidden, the buried. When the Damnation manuscripts were unearthed in 1902, they didn't go to a museum. They didn't end up in state archives. They were sold, privately, quietly, to a man named Horace Bainbridge. On paper, he was a textile magnate from Boston. In truth, he was one of the early funders of a covert research wing within the American Psychological Warfare Department, what would eventually become known as Project Whisper. Bainbridge had one obsession: psychological control. He believed America's next war wouldn't be fought on battlefields. It would be fought in minds. And when he received the Damnation texts, he knew he wasn't looking at some rural superstition. He called them a technological relic of spiritual engineering. By 1917, excerpts from the manuscripts were being studied at Camp Peary, an early intelligence facility in Virginia. The techniques were dissected, renamed, adapted. Rupture of self-image became personality fragmentation. Insertion of external authority was filed under suggestibility amplification. Sound familiar? That's because they reemerged decades later under more official-sounding labels during the MKUltra trials. Terms like ego death, behavioral restructuring, and trauma-induced reprogramming. But they all point back to the same place: the pit, the chapel, the chain-sealed box, the Damnation blueprint. In 1949, a memo surfaced in the CIA subcommittee discussing anomalous historical documents currently informing deep-structure interrogation protocols. Attached was a scan of the original Damnation crest, now labeled Artifact D72, B source, pre-mass control era/Louisiana. It gets darker. A team of psychiatric consultants working for the Defense Department in 1952 requested access to legacy control literature sourced from occult rural frameworks. Internal notes confirmed that at least 6 of the Damnation family's psychological procedures were being actively trialed on unwitting subjects. Among them, the mirror baptism protocol, fragmentation via reflection-induced panic, the silent pit method, isolation without time cues, the redemption spiral, a loop of confession reward punishment to induce surrender. These weren't spiritual practices. They were control systems. And the government didn't invent them. They borrowed them. So the next time someone tells you the world just got more controlling with time, remember this. The techniques used to break men in black sites, to rewrite identities in secret prisons, to silence whistleblowers and dismantle resistance, they were all perfected over a century ago by a family that claimed to serve God, but served only power. In Section 10, we look into the eyes of the man who reactivated the damnation doctrine for modern use. A Cold War agent who once called the old rituals sacred tools in a war for minds. And what he did with them will chill you. His name was Edward Mallory Thorne, code name Crucible. He wore a suit like a preacher and smiled like a man who'd never lost a war. But inside Langley, he was known as something else. The operator who brought the pit to the Pentagon, born in 1912. Thorne was the great-grandson of Obadiah Thorne, the last known spiritual registrar for the damnation family before their exile. And though he grew up in Washington, D.C., he was raised on the damnation texts, passed down like a sacred inheritance, hidden in his family's basement behind a false wall. He memorized them before he was 13. By 1946, he'd already served in OSS counterintelligence during World War II and had overseen 2 covert reprogramming camps in post-war Berlin. But what disturbed his superiors was how intuitive Thorne's methods were. He didn't consult manuals. He didn't need guidance. His techniques, dark, precise, and deeply personal, were ancestral. It was in 1951, during a classified CIA summit on cognitive weaponization, that Thorne presented what he called the pit model: interruption, submission, and rebirth of the human will. The pitch wasn't theoretical. He brought in a subject, unwilling but compliant, and, over 72 hours, demonstrated a complete personality inversion using only sensory manipulation, fasting, rhythmic exposure, and deep scripted shame cycles. No drugs, no tech, just rituals. Rituals that hadn't been seen publicly since the pine woods of Caddo Parish. Thorne told his peers, "We don't need machines to break minds. We only need memory, ritual, and authority." His methods were approved for black site experimentation. In exchange, he was granted command over Project Reverend, a little-known wing of MKUltra, specializing in ritualized trauma programming. And here's where it gets even darker. He didn't call his subjects patients or operatives. He called them lambs. And every file began with the phrase, "This lamb shall forget who he was and become who he is commanded to be." Over the next decade, Thorne personally oversaw over 130 reprogramming sessions, some of which were leaked years later by whistleblowers too frightened to testify publicly. One defected scientist wrote, "We weren't studying trauma. We were perfecting the rituals of the damnation family, brick by brick in fluorescent-lit rooms." Thorne died in 1979, wealthy, respected, buried with honors, but not before he made one final donation to the National Cryptographic Archive, a sealed black box labeled Doctrine of the Pit/original copy for future wars. Its contents remain classified. The tape was labeled simply, Session 119B, Crucible/Lamb number 17. Date, April 2nd, 1978. Location, Facility C, undisclosed site, West Virginia. At first, the audio is quiet. You hear breathing, a faint, rhythmic humming. Then a door creaks open, a chair scrapes, and a man speaks. Calm, collected, measured like a priest. "Tell me your name." Silence. "You don't have one, do you?" "That's because you've been cleansed. That old identity, that was the infection. Now we build something worthy." The voice is unmistakably Edward Thorne. For the next 57 minutes, he leads the subject, an adult male estimated between 22 and 26, through a 4-phase ritual. The language used is nearly identical to the damnation texts unearthed in 1902. Each phase mimics a spiritual transformation, but inverted, a debaptism of sorts. Phase 1, The hollowing. The subject is deprived of self-reference. Mirrors removed. Names stripped. Spoken only in second person. Thorne repeats a phrase. The man you were was made of lies. You are not him. You are the vessel. Phase 2, the ash confession. A ritualized act where the subject is forced to admit to crimes he never committed. Why? Because belief is irrelevant. The goal is compliance through surrender of reality. Every protest is met with silence. No threats. Just say it or remain in the dark. Phase 3, the spiral of mercy. Here, Thorne offers comfort. He reads affirming statements, applies ointment to the subject's hands, calls him my child. This sudden care induces cognitive collapse, a reward-punishment loop with no logic. The subject begins to thank Thorne. He whispers, I was wrong, over and over. Phase 4, naming the vessel. Thorne ends a ritual by giving the subject a new identity, a false one, a name drawn from a code book of biblical and esoteric references, cross-reference with the original damnation family ledger. In this case, Malachi 7 verse 13. That verse doesn't exist. There is no Malachi 7. It's a ghost verse, just like the man is now a ghost of who he was. The tape ends with this chilling line. You are ready. When the time comes, you will act, and you will not know why. Analysts who reviewed the tape in 1984 refused to listen twice. One classified report simply read, subject has been successfully emptied and reassembled. The pit doctrine functions at 100% efficacy. His name, before the ritual, was Jacob Ellery Wren, age 25, born in Ohio, drafted at 19, honorably discharged at 22. No criminal record, no history of instability, just a quiet, obedient American, until he vanished for 11 months. When he resurfaced in 1979, he had no memory of the missing time. He told his sister he'd gone west for work, but she said he was different. His eyes didn't blink as often. He talked in biblical phrases, sometimes in riddles. At night, he'd write pages and pages of strange symbols and tear them up before morning. Then came July 6, 1980. Jacob walked into St. Aurelius Children's Hospital in Baltimore carrying a briefcase. He was calm, smiling. Security footage shows him entering the East Wing at exactly 3:33 p.m. The briefcase never left his hand. What happened next was sealed by federal order within 48 hours. But leaked documents from 1992 reveal the truth. Inside that briefcase was a modified neurosonic emitter, military-grade, compact, unregistered. When activated, it emitted a low-frequency pulse targeting the amygdala, the fear center of the brain. Within 6 minutes, everyone on the East Wing, patients, doctors, nurses, was either catatonic, self-harming, or dead. The scene was described in one internal report as a human prayer circle of chaos. No signs of external violence, yet every mind collapsed inward. The official story? A chemical spill. The real story? Jacob Wren had been activated. One declassified memo from the Defense Intelligence Agency reads, subject identifier, Malachi 7 verse 13. Status, asset engaged. Response to trigger, immediate, complete. Damage, within projected parameters. Notes, subject has no memory post-event. Reintegration failed. This wasn't a rogue act. It was a test. A human mind, hollowed and filled with the damnation doctrine, then loose on a civilian population to measure precision, impact, and traceability. And here's the most terrifying part. Jacob never went to prison. He was transferred to a secure rehabilitation facility. But the location? Unknown. The name? Wiped. And 3 years later, a man matching his exact description was spotted at a secure briefing in Quantico, wearing a visitor badge, standing behind a high-ranking official during a closed-door meeting. Some say Jacob was a one-time weapon. Others believe he was just the first of many. What began as a cursed bloodline became a global weaponized doctrine. By 1983, the damnation ritual model, once confined to the dark basements of the American intelligence community, was no longer American. It had gone transnational. Following the St. Aurelius incident and the successful activation of Malachi 7 verse 13, redacted cables surfaced and leaked NSA logs showing discrete knowledge transfers to several allied and non-allied nations. The code phrase used? The furnace is hot. Every time that phrase appeared in foreign intercepts, one thing followed: a shift in population behavior patterns. Cult formation, mass delusions, ritualized violence, or extreme ideological obedience within closed communities. Here's what the record reveals. 1984, Turkey. A sudden rise of a religious cult called the Disciples of the Hollow Book in the southeastern region of Anatolia. Within 9 months, over 2,000 members disappeared into underground compounds. No formal ideology, just repeated mantras about shedding the skin of the world and ascending the spiral. Turkish intelligence raided one of these sites in 1985. Inside, they found a perfect replica of the damnation pit structure described in Project Reverend Blueprints. How did they get it? A Turkish counterintelligence officer later admitted during a secret tribunal. The Americans sold us the doctrine. We thought we were buying a tool. We were buying a demon. 1986, East Germany. In Dresden, a psychiatric institution known as Klinik Schwarzlich began experimenting with non-chemical trauma cycles to rewrite memory in political dissidents. 14 patients disappeared, records erased. But one nurse leaked a handbook titled, Reconstruction of the Vessel, Rituals of Rebirth for the Wayward Mind. The footnotes were in English. One passage read, This ritual is drawn from the Pit Doctrine, as refined by Crucible in 1957. Applied with discipline, it restores obedience without memory. 1990, Nigeria. In a remote region near the Niger Delta, entire villages began speaking a constructed dialect not native to any tribal lineage. Linguists brought and found the dialect to be a phonetic cipher, matching ritual incantations from damnation family texts. These communities claimed to receive visions from the man who spoke in spirals, a likely reference to Edward Thorne. Global intelligence agencies noticed, but instead of suppression, they replicated it. Why? Because this system of ritual-based psychological control worked faster, lasted longer, and left fewer traces than any drug or electric shock method ever developed. The pit was no longer a place. It was a template, exported, adapted, and embedded into political cults, military conditioning programs, and even religious revivalist groups funded by covert operations. As of 1992, internal CIA memos listed the pit model as officially unacknowledged, actively disseminated. In other words, we deny it, but we're spreading it. The question isn't how they did it. It's why it worked so perfectly. To understand the terrifying success of the damnation ritual model, we must enter the realm where psychology ends and something far more ancient begins. You see, this wasn't just trauma-based control. It was ritualized inversion of identity, structured, repeatable, precise. The system was designed not to destroy the mind, but to remake it into something obedient, yet utterly convinced it was free. Here's the core blueprint, classified under Doctrine V. The 4 pillars of pit conversion. Pillar 1. Erase yourself through rhythmic dissociation. Participants were subjected to repetitive sounds, metronomic tones, chants, or phrases in altered frequency bands. The goal? To force the brain into theta state, where identity becomes fluid and external suggestion bypasses critical reasoning. This wasn't hypnosis. It was a ritualized seizure of consciousness. Thorne called this the washing. Pillar 2. Force guilt through implanted memory. Subject were shown fabricated footage, simulated crimes, doctored photographs, manipulated audio, all designed to convince them they had done something evil. The visual shocks were paired with emotional stimulation. Smells of rot, cries of children, whispers in low frequencies. Within hours, 78% of subjects accepted false guilt voluntarily. They begged for redemption. Pillar 3. Confession and rebirth through naming. This is where the damnation family bloodline theology entered. Each vessel was given a new name, rooted in forbidden biblical verses, coded numerology, or extinct dialects from pre-Christian mystery religions. These names weren't random. They were keys, designed to bind a person's new identity into a framework of submission as purity. One recorded session shows a subject sobbing, whispering, "I am not Matthew. I am Vessel 9. I was born in flame. I serve the spiral." Pillar 4, the trigger. This is the darkest part. Every vessel was programmed with a personal activation phrase, embedded during the theta state conditioning. The phrases were usually meaningless to outsiders. Combinations like "the orchard waits" or "sleep beneath the spiral." But once spoken in the subject's presence, the result was instantaneous. Dissociation, command response, obedience to next instruction, zero memory of the event. One CIA file from 1987 describes a subject who, after activation, assassinated a federal judge in public, returned to his hotel, and spent the next 2 hours watching cartoons, unaware anything had happened. But why go to such lengths? Because the damnation family believed something profound. That free will was infection, and ritualized programming was divine purification. They weren't just making weapons. They were building a new religious order, one based not on worship, but on submission through unknowing obedience. Buried deep beneath the Vatican Apostolic Archive, in a restricted vault marked Umbri Fidei/1620, lies a book few have ever heard of, and fewer still have survived reading. Its name, Liber Umbri, the Book of the Shadow God, bound in faded black goat skin, written in ecclesiastical Latin and Paleo-Greek. The book was officially condemned by Pope Urban VIII in 1621, declared heretical, dangerous, and instruments of the deceiver's voice. But it was never destroyed. Why? Because even the church feared what it contained. A ritual model eerily identical to the damnation doctrine, centuries before the damnation family ever existed. According to fragments released by Vatican whistleblower Father Lucien Bravon, the Liber Umbri was believed to be a compilation of stolen rituals. Fragments taken from Sumerian death cults, Gnostic heresies, and Egyptian psycho-spiritual rites, all reinterpreted under the Christian lens of demonic possession. But here's the horror. The core of its methodology was not to expel demons, but to replace the soul. It described a 4-stage process nearly identical to the damnation family's modern programming techniques. Vacatio mentis, the emptying of the mind through rhythmic repetition and sound. Falsus peccatum, the implanting of false sin. Renominatio, renaming of the soul to align with the desired spirit. Excitatio, the triggering of the new self via spoken incantation. This wasn't exorcism. It was spiritual override. And then came the most disturbing passage in the book. He who walks without his name shall hear the true God, but he who is renamed by the shadow shall serve unknowing. His memory will fall like ash. His will shall not return. The implications are chilling. What the church deemed demonic in the 1600s, the U.S. intelligence community industrialized in the 1970s. And the connection doesn't stop at theory. Inside a leaked 1993 intelligence briefing labeled Project Ecclesia, CIA analysts detail an operation in 1965 where agents infiltrated the Vatican's occult research section. Their goal: retrieve documentation on ancestral ritual templates with proven behavioral override capacity. They succeeded. The files were handed over to Edward Thorne, who referred to Liber Umbri repeatedly in his unpublished notes. In one margin, he scribbled, "The shadow god is not a myth. It is the original pit." Even more unsettling, images surfaced from the damnation family estate in 1981, showing altar engravings matching glyphs found in the Liber Umbri. Somewhere in their twisted theology, the damnation family didn't invent their methods. They revived them, guided by ancient doctrines buried by terrified priests and forgotten over centuries. There are places on earth that feel wrong, heavy, silent, suffocating. The crypt beneath Église Saint-Nicolas in Marseille is one of them. In 1997, defrocked Archbishop Henri de Roche made a startling claim to a French occultist journal that beneath this 13th century cathedral, a sealed chamber had been discovered, one not listed in any church blueprint. He claimed it wasn't a crypt. It was a ritual vault, constructed before the cathedral itself. French authorities dismissed him as delusional. But in 2003, a private research team funded by an anonymous foundation reopened the chamber. What they found changed everything. At the base of the catacomb was a spiral path of human remains, dozens of skeletons arranged deliberately, not dumped, all facing inward toward a central altar stone carved with the spiral eye of the pit. The bones had been polished. Forensic analysis later confirmed these weren't medieval peasants. They were ritually prepared remains, their joints dislocated post-mortem, their skulls etched with a symbol matching the one found in Edward Thorne's private grimoire. The altar? It was cut from black basalt, magnetically reactive, and etched with Latin inscriptions that translated to, "What we bury here is not dead. What we awaken shall not remember the world." Among the ruins, sealed in a lead reliquary, was a vellum manuscript written in a hybrid of Latin and Proto-Basque, translated by linguistic AI in 2018. It referred to a spiral doctrine brought to southern France during the Albigensian Crusade in the 13th century, when heretical Cathars were exterminated by the Church. But the Cathars didn't die out. According to the manuscript, a splinter sect survived underground, preserving ancient rituals that predated Christianity, Judaism, even Rome. This sect called themselves the servants of the unbound vessel. They believed the human soul was a parasite, clinging to flesh, clinging to memory, clinging to freedom. Their sacred duty was to unbind it through ritual, trauma, and transformation. The soul must be made to forget itself. One line read, "Only then can the spiral speak." Now here's where the nightmare sharpens. DNA evidence from a tooth found in the crypt was processed in 2020. The result? 97% match to the damnation family mitochondrial line. This means what was buried in Marseille wasn't just symbolically connected. It was genetically connected. The pit was older than the American bloodline, older than Thorne, older than the Vatican's fears. This ritual system, the spiral, the memory wipe, the name change, the trigger phrases, was ancient. All Edward Thorne did was translate it into a modern machine. It was called Operation Excision, but the name never appeared in public documents. No press coverage, no official record, just a rumor passed among intelligence circles like a curse. The operation took place in November 2004, deep in the Scottish Highlands, under the cover of a joint NATO war games drill. But the target wasn't military. It was a crumbling estate known as Carac House, hidden behind dense pine forests miles from any village. Inside, satellite surveillance had detected heat signatures, chants, and unknown symbol formations drawn in ash across the snow-covered grounds. British intelligence suspected a rogue cult, but what they found was something much older and much worse. The raid team entered at 3:12 a.m. What they discovered was a replica of the pit ritual model, recreated in precise detail. Spiral glyphs painted on walls in black oil, chambers with mirrorless rooms, used for identity erasure, walls lined with child height restraints, audio recordings looping phrases like, "The name is not yours, the self is a cage." In the center of the estate was a stone altar, cracked and blood-stained. Next to it, a group of 11 children, aged 6 to 12, sitting in absolute silence, eyes wide, hands folded. They didn't cry. They didn't resist. They only spoke when asked a specific phrase. "Who do you serve?" Their answer, in unison, "The spiral." Each child had a shaved head and a number tattooed into their inner arm in faint red ink. They didn't know their original names. They referred to themselves as vessels, followed by their number. One girl, Vessel 7, whispered something that froze every operative in the room. "The old blood sleeps. But the architect is not gone. Thorne lives in Spiral. He will awaken the restored pit." Inside a hidden basement vault, the team recovered over 2,000 pages of documents, ritual scripts, psychological control diagrams, and references to Project Umbra, the original CIA brain control pilot program. But this was no rogue cult. This was a continuation, a damnation cell, one of several, seated across the world, waiting for activation. And most chilling of all, a folder marked Genealogical Directive, Spiral 13, containing birth records, adoption files, and foster care transfers for over 300 children across the UK, all traced back to American orphanages, military hospitals, black budget psychology programs, Edward Thorne was supposed to have died in 1989, burned alive during a compound fire in Nebraska. But according to a voice recording found at Kerouac House, he wasn't just alive. He had transcended. In the distorted tape, a man's voice calmed low, chilling whispers. This flesh was a temporary temple. Now I am in all of them. The pit is no longer a place. It is a system. In the shadow of the Andes, nestled in the rural outskirts of Villa La Angostura, Argentina, stands a weather-worn clinic with no sign, no directory, and no digital footprint. Locals call it La Casa del Olvido, the House of Forgetting. Officially, it was a trauma recovery center, opened in 1982 by an American doctor under the name Robert Kelmar. But to those who survived its walls, he wasn't Kelmar. He was Dr. Adrian Vale, a high-level MKUltra defector. And what he built in that secluded corner of South America was not for healing. It was a continuation of something dark, something ancient. Testimonies from 3 survivors, all now in hiding, paint a picture more horrifying than any Cold War experiment. Patients were brought in after breakdowns they could not explain. They had false memories implanted and real memories buried under layered suggestion. The facility used a mirrorless chamber with walls that pulse with sound, subsonic tones designed to dissolve mental boundaries. One subject, a woman named Luciana G., remembered only fragments. They said I had no name. They called me Vessel 42. I screamed and they smiled. They said the pain meant I was waking up. Another patient, Diego Marquez, was abducted at 11 and recovered at 16 from a border raid. He remembered a man with pale eyes and a red ring who taught them to chant in the dark. He said the soul is a mask, that the body must be carved open so the spiral can see. When shown a picture of Edward Thorne taken in the 1970s, Diego paused. He nodded. It's him, but older, less human. Inside the clinic, after a 2011 investigation prompted by a UN human rights group, authorities found 46 medical files with no national identity numbers, audio recordings labeled Excitatio, the same name found in Liber Umbri, and in a sealed steel drawer, a notebook bearing the spiralized sigil with the words, "The pit breathes through forgotten." Every page detailed procedures nearly identical to those recovered in Operation Excision, except these were medicalized, sanitized, written as if they were part of neuroscience. The final, most disturbing detail: one of the clinic's Argentine staff secretly photographed a group therapy session in 2005. Among the group was a tall, gaunt man with deep scarring across his throat. Facial recognition analysis, run by a private firm in 2019, produced a 73% probability match with Edward Thorne. The timestamp? March 3, 2005, 16 years after his supposed death. And in the notebook found in his office, one phrase is written again and again: "The spiral must return to America. The temple is ready." The name of the school was Black Hollow Academy, tucked away in the frozen woods of Windsor County, Vermont, established in 1894 under Episcopal management. But by 1996, the institution was bought out quietly by a philanthropic research group operating under the name Covenant Restoration Trust, a shell corporation with ties to both Project Monarch and the Damnation Genealogical Map. At first glance, it was a prestigious boarding school for the elite. But beneath the manicured facade was a program that would shock even hardened federal agents. Black Hollow wasn't educating children. It was activating them. When FBI cyberforensics raided the Black Hollow Digital Archives in 2013 during a child exploitation investigation, they discovered encrypted files labeled under a codename, Project Echo Spiral. Within those files, psychological profiles of 96 students, each with trauma markers consistent with ritual abuse, daily regimens of hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and exposure to symbols derived from pit doctrine, test exercises in which students were told to speak to their mirror selves and surrender control for 1 hour. These weren't hallucinations. They were split-state drills, deliberate identity fracturing. The curriculum trained children to detach from self, obey code phrases, and follow commands from an internal voice that many began calling the Spiral Man. One survivor, who now goes by the alias Lucas 3 to 7, shared this horrifying memory. We were shown faces of people we didn't know, told they were our real parents. Then they said, "You have no mother, no father. The pit chose you." They made us watch footage of people in pain until we stopped reacting. Then they made us smile while we watched it. Lucas claims he met others like him across the country at spiritual retreat centers, funded by the same trust. All of them had the spiral sigil tattooed beneath the hairline, invisible unless shaved, and all of them reported the same phrase whispered in dreams. "The name is not yours. The soul belongs to the spiral." The most disturbing discovery came from a former janitor who smuggled out a single page from what he called the Black Book. On it were the names of 17 students, each with a code beside them. Vessel Type A, hollow, ready for full overwrite. Vessel Type B, echo, contains dual state control. Vessel Type C, anchor, linked to a primary through blood. 6 of the names were matched by federal analysts to the damnation bloodline. One name, underlined in red, simply read, Gideon Thorne, Anchor C13, the son of Edward Thorne. And according to the school's records, he vanished in 2010, last seen walking into the mirrorless chamber below the East Wing, and never walking out. In October 2023, a video surfaced on the dark web. Grainy, infrared, 6 minutes long. It showed a man in ceremonial robes, arms outstretched, standing in the ruins of the Thorne estate in Kentucky. Around him were 13 figures, kneeling, blindfolded, and chanting in unison. The flesh is borrowed. The name is void. The pit reclaims the soul. The man's face was partially obscured, but facial mapping software, run privately by ex-military analysts, returned a 94% match with Gideon Thorne. But this man claimed a different name. In the final moments of the video, he stared directly into the infrared lens and whispered, "I am not his son. I am what remains after the pit consumes the blood. I am the spiral incarnate." 2 months later, the damnation site, which had been cordoned off by Homeland Security since 2006, was found breached. Inside the underground structure, spiral glyphs had been redrawn across the walls. The pit had been excavated deeper, nearly 40 feet beyond the original chamber. Fresh blood, arranged in 13 concentric rings, surrounded a stone altar now marked with new symbol, a spiral with an eye at its center and black thorns growing outward. Nearby, a note was recovered, written in a spiral across the wall in human ash. He never died. He was reborn in the mind of the hollow, and the children of the spiral, now awakened. Since then, 5 former spiral-linked institutions across the U.S., Canada, and South America have gone dark, buildings abandoned, staff vanished. In their place, anonymous live streams began appearing, strange rituals in basements, children standing silently in perfect geometric formation, whispered prayers in extinct languages, the phrase that always returns. The harvest begins with remembrance. And now, reports have surfaced of vessels reactivating, individuals who, decades ago, were supposedly deprogrammed. One such woman, formerly known as Vessel 9, began drawing spirals across her walls in blood. When restrained and questioned, she repeated a single sentence: "The incarnate walks. The pit is open. We are no longer alone." Here's what that means. The damnation bloodline was never just a family. It was a design, a mechanism, a tool forged over centuries to bring forth a consciousness that exists beyond flesh. Edward Thorne was merely the vessel for the first signal. Gideon is the anchor, the one who has opened the gate again. And now, it may no longer be possible to stop it, because the pit is no longer buried. It lives in systems, in children, in memories, in institutions that still wear the face of care and education. And the final phrase left on Gideon's altar reads, "All names will be returned to the pit, and from the spiral, they will rise as many." This concludes a twisted legacy of the damnation bloodline, a tale of terror,